Before we get into the ID and class selector goodness, let's work with a special type of selector. It's called the all selector, and as its name suggests, it's for selecting all the elements within a page. The reason I want to use this is I want to get rid of all the extra spaces that are here by default. By default, above and below each block element, so that would be an H1, the header, paragraph, unordered lists, H2, and so on, they have a space above and below them. And that's from either a margin that's on there by default or padding or both. Now, margin would be the space outside an element. This portion here with the background color, that's inside, right? And then margin would be outside. That would be the margin causing that extra space. And then padding would be inside. Right now, it doesn't look like there's any kind of padding because I can see that the text goes all the way to the edge. If it had padding, then there would be extra space between the edge of the container and the content itself. By doing something like this, using the all selector, this saves me from having to create a separate CSS rule for each element that I want to select. Like I don't have to create an H1 where I say margin 0 pixels, padding 0 pixels. I don't have to put P and then put in these same decorations. I don't have to try to target H2. This is just selecting everything. Let's save our HTML file and see if this works. And now we've removed every single margin or padding from each element. And we could always add that back in by specifically targeting a particular element. And you've already learned about adding or using element selectors. These correspond to different element names that we are currently using in our HTML, like body, header, and footer. Now, what about classes of ID selectors? Where do they fit in? Well, let's see. Let's start with the ID selector, and then in the next video, we'll do the class selector. With the ID selector, the syntax for that is you use a # or hashtag, and then whatever you want to name it. And see, that's where it's different now from these element selectors. These are tags that are used for HTML elements. Well, this one, we could call it whatever makes sense to us. And for an ID, only one element in a page can have that specific ID. So once we use an ID and apply that to an element in the HTML, that cannot be applied to any other element on the same page. And then also that element that has that ID, it can no longer have other IDs applied to it. So let's see what I mean by all of that. Let's create a or an ID selector. There's our hashtag, and then whatever we want to call it. I want to target this semantics H1 element here. I'll call it main title because that's what this is for, the main title. Now notice that I did not have any spaces in there. If I wanted to separate words, I'm going to use a dash, or you could use an underscore too. Just make sure you don't use spaces. And just like any other selector, it'll have the opening and closing curly brackets. And for this one, I want to add two properties. Let's do a border that will go around the H1 element, or once I apply this to that H1 element. So I want it to be 4 pixels thick. And then for the next property would be the type of line. I'm using Dreamweaver, so it already gives me the different possibilities. I can have a medium line, thick, thin, dashed. What I want is solid. And then for the color, well, you've already seen two ways to add color. We could use a color name or a hex value. Now let's do RGB. RGB, and then opening, closing parentheses. And then inside that would be 3 values separated by commas corresponding with the red, green, and blue. And I'll go ahead and use my color wheel here, and let's make our border be this dark shade here, dark shade of goodness. So that's 88 for the red, 0 for the green, and 178 for the blue. 88, 0, 178. And again, notice I separated each one with a comma and a space, and I'll put my semicolon there. As for the other property, I will show you that after I talk about a couple of other things. Let's go ahead and save this, and nothing's going to happen to our page preview yet because we've only done half the step to using ID selectors. I've created the ID selector. Now I have to have a way to hook that to a particular element. And I mentioned I want to use it for the semantics H1 element. So to hook this ID selector, I go to the opening H1 tag and put in an ID attribute. And for the value, it would be just the name of that ID selector. Now for this to work, you want to make sure that this matches exactly how we have it in our CSS. I have it as main-title, so that's how I have it here. And I don't need the pound sign or hashtag because I already said ID over here. So now we have hooked this ID selector to this H1 element. And let's see what happens. So save your HTML, save your CSS, and refresh your page preview. And if it worked out correctly for you, you should have a border around your H1 element. Now notice, as a block element, it will take up the entire width of your browser window. That's why no matter how big or small I make my browser window, it will always take up 100% of the width. That's just what block elements do. Kind of like that's just what cats do. They meow, right? So block elements, they take up the entire width of their containers. Now, I can change that with CSS. I could tell it to have a different width. Let's say 50%. Now, no matter how big or small I make my browser window, it will only be 50% of the container. If you look, it's keeping the proportions there. And if you think about it, this is how you go about creating fluid and responsive pages. We use percentages instead of fixed values using pixels. Now let's add some notes so that we can remember this later on. Here in the CSS portion, let's say next to main title that this is an ID selector. It can be applied to only one element per HTML page. Since we've already used ID equals main title to this H1 on this page, I can apply the same ID to another element. Now recall that we have two H1 elements here. We have this semantics, and then we have this portion here. This is a size 1 heading. Well, it doesn't have the border around it because we didn't hook this ID equals main title to it. And we can't anyway because we've already used the ID equals main title on this semantics H1. And one more thing about IDs, once you apply it to a particular element, I can't apply any more IDs to that particular element. So I can't put in another ID for this H1 because it's already got an ID. Okay, then one last thing before we move on to the next video. Let's add a comment here about this main title ID attribute that we just added to this H1. We'll say the CSS properties associated with the ID selector. That's this right here, main title. And the CSS properties I'm referring to are these right here, border and width. Okay, so the CSS properties associated with the ID selector are hooked to this H1 element. All right, so in the next video, let's see about adding classes on there.